Hello, everyone. This is Sarah from Hamilton. Today, we are continuing our series of discussions with Ken Griffith on his revision of ancient chronology and its relationship to the biblical history. Before we get into this discussion, I just want to say that if you look at the pinned comment, you will see a link to a recent compilation of essays that I've published on Amazon, which you can purchase there. And I am also offering a class, Answering Judaism's Rejection of Jesus, which you can purchase at seraphimhamilton.com. With that said, I'm very excited to get into today's discussion. How you doing, Ken?
Good to be here.
Good to see you. We want to get into today the discussion of the United Monarchy of Israel and its relationship to the Mari Archive. So, would you just tell us a little bit about what the Mari Archive is, where it's located in the conventional chronology, and where you place it in your chronological framework?
Sure. So Mari it was a city located about halfway down the halfway down the Euphrates River from the bend in the Euphrates near Carchemish, which was a famous ancient city where you could cross the river. So, and then Babylon. So Mari was about halfway in between. And it was originally built in I think in the Neolithic era. It was a planned city probably around the lifetime of Nimrod. And it went through three phases. The first phase, it was this beautiful planned city on the river, and then someone destroyed it. And then the second, it was rebuilt, and then Sargon of Akkad destroyed it. And then the third time, it lasted from basically the Ur-3 period down to the 36th year of Hammurabi, and then Hammurabi destroyed it, and nobody ever rebuilt it. So when they dug it up, in around the 1930s to the 50s, the archaeologists found thousands of these diplomatic tablets in this one room of the palace. So they were able to decipher those tablets, and they're called the Mari archives, and it was the communications between the king of Mari and the surrounding nations. And so these tablets kind of shine a lot of light into the history at that time. The question is, when was that time? So Hammurabi is typically placed around 1800 BC, as well as a man named Shamshi-Adad, who was a king of Assyria. And we found that Shamshi-Adad actually, the person that they've pegged all of the history to, actually lived around the time of King Saul and King David, and that he conquered Assyria in the year 1053 BC. And we have a number of durations that very precisely pinpoint that year. And the Assyrian king list even preserves that year. In the Assyrian king list, they have a Shamshi-Adad the fourth, and they have him conquering. They said he came up from Karduniash, which is Babylon, and conquered Ashur. But then they have a short reign for him, and I think the reason is that he didn't stay in Assyria. He basically conquered the city, installed a vassal king, and then he went up here to the north, this area of the upper Khabur River. He built a city called Shobat Enlil, and that was his capital. And the question would be, why would a king of Assyria have his capital way up here, in what's effectively the border between Syria and Turkey? And I think the answer to that is that he was actually a Hurrian Mitannian king, who conquered Assyria. And the Assyrians are a little bit embarrassed by this. So they, in their king list, they claim that he was the son of Tiglath-Pileser the first, who had lived decades earlier. And we think there's more to the story than that. So the surrounding cities you've got this kingdom of Mari, and then you've got the kingdom of Babylonia, and down here, Hammurabi is reigning in Babylon. You've got the kingdom of Assyria, which this guy Shamshi-Adad had conquered, and now he conquered also Mari later, and he installed one son as a king of Mari and one son in this city called Ekallatum, which is apparently his original home base. So that kind of covers my my answer to that question. We can go into more details.
Yeah. Would you just clarify for the viewers? I'm not sure if they know. Just briefly, what is the Assyrian king list?
Okay, the Assyrian king list. Wait, let me fix my sharing here. Sorry about that. I've lost you. So the Assyrian king list was found in the palace of Ashurbanipal, and they found actually a number of copies from different palaces of the Assyrians. Um, and it lists the Assyrian kings going back what appears to be almost 1800 years from before the fall of Samaria, that which happened in the Bible. The fall of Samaria was either 722, 721, or 720 BC, and Bible scholars argue about that. So at any rate, you have this list of kings and it tells how long each of them reigned. And then for certain periods of the Assyrian king list, we also have what's called an eponym list. The city of Asher, instead of just having this is the year 2023 from the advent of Christ, like we do, that's our dating system. Instead of having an era dating system, they just had the year of the king, and specifically the year of each year had a name of an official. So for example, you'd say this year was the year of Anthony Blinken. He'd be Secretary of State. And so the Assyrians would rotate through their officials, each one having a year named after him during the administration of a particular king. So we have a lot of data about the Assyrian kings, but it's also kind of in a weird format that we have to do some detective work to kind of put the pieces together. So that's kind of the background that we have. It's a tool for placing and dating the Assyrian kings, but it's not perfect.
Okay. And you've said so the conventional date for Shamshi-Adad and thus the Mari archive is 1800 BC. And you've moved that down by about 700 years or so. And you mentioned that you've gotten that by a number of durations that you get from various sources. Would you be able to just sketch out a couple of those?
Sure. I don't have good pictures this time. Sorry, I'll just do it verbally. So it's mainly Hammurabi. We have from the Sumerian king list, which is also a tablet dug up in Babylon that had lists of dynasties of Babylon in the area of Babylon. So the Sumerian king list gives us 4 dynasties between the fall of Akkad and basically Hammurabi's defeat of Rim-Sin of Larsa. And those 4 dynasties are the Uruk IV dynasty, the Gutian dynasty, Ur-3, and then Ison. And then after that, we have your names for the city of Larsa. Larsa was the city that conquered Ison. It's down here. You can see there's Larsa, there's Ison, and Ur was right there. And so each of these was kind of dominating for a period of time. So Ison is replaced by Larsa, and then Larsa's last king was named Rim-Sin, and Rim-Sin got conquered by Hammurabi of Babylon. So we have exactly the number of years from the fall of Akkad until Hammurabi defeated Rim-Sin. And then from the Babylonian king list, which is another king list dug up in Babylon, we have the exact number of years from Hammurabi to the end of the dynasty, that dynasty of Babylon, when a different tablet tells us the man of Hatti attacked Akkad. And Hatti was the city of Hattusa up here, and this Hittite empire. There are lots of little Hittite kings in this little area of this corner of Asia. And there was a king named Mercilus I, and he conquered a king of Yamhad named Yaramlim III. And then after, this is their capital, was Halab or Aleppo. Today it's the city of Aleppo. After he conquered Yaramlim III, then he said that he went down and conquered Babylon. And then he brings all this loot back from Babylon, but then not a long time after that, he got murdered by his officials. So we have Babylonian tablets that seem to mention this sack of Babylon by a Hittite at the end of Hammurabi's dynasty, and it's an exact number of years. So based on our placement of the fall of Akkad in 1477, we concluded that Hammurabi should have died around 998 BC, 989 BC. And then we were looking about 150 years later for the evidence of this this Hittite king conquering Babylon. Yeah, and I found this paper by a guy named Barry Kernock, who is a British revisionist historian who's done some good videos. He's got 3 or 4 videos on the internet, and he has done a number of papers in the SIS review. And he had a paper showing that Shalmaneser III of Assyria, he intervened in this civil war in Babylon in his, I think, 8th or 9th year, which would have been around 851 BC. And Kernock identifies that civil war as these 2 brothers fighting over who will be king of Babylon, and the brother who was on the out, meaning the one who wasn't chosen but was fighting for the throne anyway, he basically paid the Hittites to come and help him, and they sacked Babylon. And then Hammurabi goes looking for it, and he hunts down the he basically not Hammurabi, Shalmaneser III. Shalmaneser III basically intervenes, and he defeats the rebel king, and then he actually goes to Aleppo and kind of demands the loot back that had been carried away. So Kernock's paper, you can take it for what it is. We thought it was a pretty strong case, and it just happened to fit exactly in our chronology, and enabled us to basically have anchors for Hammurabi going back to the fall of Akkad and forward to the sack of Babylon. So that's why we say we have it very precise. It's within the year. It's quite accurate.
And you've also identified Shamshi-Adad with a figure in the Bible. Could you just explore that briefly?
Yes. Let me scroll down to this. I'm jumping ahead in my... Okay. These are names and characters that we find on the left. We have characters in the Mari letters, and with the exception of Shalshatar, that was found in a different city and believed to be a different era, and we think it's the same man in a different language. So, and then the Bible. So we believe that Shamshi-Adad was Hadadezer, who was David's biggest enemy, King David's biggest enemy. But we believe that from our placement of his reign, we actually have a very detailed list of events in the reign of Shamshi-Adad, because the Assyrians, when they tried to move him back in history, they made this eponym list with the events from his reign, and we think it's kind of a forgery, and at the same time kind of the same, and I'll explain it. They wanted to put him back in history around the same time as Sargon the Great and Naram-Sin. And so in the Assyrian king list, you see a Sargon I and a Naram-Sin of Assyria. And we think these are actually the Akkadian kings by that name, which conventional Assyriologists would disagree, but we have pretty strong evidence for it. That those kings had basically conquered Ashur, or at least maybe Ashur had been their allies at any rate, because there's no record that they actually conquered it. But the year names were in the names of those kings, and a couple of other kings, Erisham and Puzur Ashur. So we had this list of the eponym list, this list of year names of officials from those kings on the left column. And on the right column, we have the year Shamshi-Adad was born, and then the year Shamshi-Adad did this, the year, and this is going all the way back into the reign of Naram-Sin. Well, nowhere else in the Assyrian king list, nowhere else in a eponym list do you ever have a king being born in the eponym list, because of course nobody knows who's going to be king in 50 years. And if your eponym list is just recording events as they happen, you can't possibly know that Shamshi-Adad is going to be king in the future. So why would you put him in the eponym list? And then the more we studied that list, the more it became obvious that what they had done was they had lifted all the events from the reign of Shamshi-Adad and his father, and they had just laid them onto a list of eponyms of kings from a different era. So effectively, they did a document merge. So the left, they're trying to make it look like Shamshi-Adad reigned earlier than he did, and to do that, they went that far. But the evidence that what I'm saying is true is that none of the kings listed on the left are mentioned in the events on the right. So Naram-Sin is king. None of his eponyms say, none of the events attached to his eponyms say anything about what Naram-Sin did, and the same for all the rest of them. So it's pretty obvious that they basically created this fake. Well, it's not entirely fake. It's got very useful information in it because it tells us everything that happened in the whole life of Shamshi-Adad year by year. So we can use that information if we put it in the right chronological context. And as it happens, there was a solar eclipse recorded the year after he was born. So that enables us to confirm our placement of it fits with the solar eclipse. So sorry for the ramble there. So at any rate, let's go back to the, I didn't want to get to that early. I wanted to actually talk about the kings that were reigning in our argument that David and Solomon were contemporaries of these kings. So after Shamshi-Adad, you had after his death, a man named Zimri-Lim conquered the city of Mari. And in the archives of Zimri-Lim, in the Mari letters, someone else wrote a letter to him, and they have this statement that's been quoted a lot because it tells us a lot about the political situation at the time. It says, "There's no king who's mighty by himself. 10 or 15 kings follow Hammurabi, the ruler of Babylon. A like number follow Rim-Sin of Larsa. A like number Ebal-Piel of Eshnuna. A like number Amud-Piel of Katanam. But 20 follow Yaram-Lim of Yamhad." Now, we believe Amud-Piel of Katanam is Amud-Piel II, and this is a reference to Solomon in the first 5 years of his reign, because by the end of his reign, Hammurabi had actually conquered Rim-Sin, and Yaram-Lim probably died around by the 15th year of Solomon and was replaced by his son Hammurabi I. So he apparently was such friends with Hammurabi of Babylon that he named one of his sons Hammurabi as well. But you see from this statement that each of the big kings had 10 or 15 small kings, and the reason was every city had a king. So that's how they looked at politics at the time. He doesn't talk about the state of Babylon or the state of Larsa or the state, the nation state of Yamhad. He is viewing the king as he is effectively the state, and then he has a following of 10 or 15 kings, which are the cities that follow him. And so you had this very fluid situation where these guys are conquering each other left and right. So Hammurabi ended up conquering Eshnuna later in his reign. He actually ended up conquering a couple of the guys in this list, and then he ends up allying with Hammurabi. And Solomon, from the letters here, appears at one time he was an enemy of Hammurabi, and then at some point he made a treaty with him.
And could you just explore the name Amud-Piel? What does that mean in your view?
So Amut-Piel means royal servant of the god El, and maybe I should have capitalized the L. That's how they had it in the book. And each of these kings, they have a local language, and they usually have a local name, and then they also have a diplomatic name that they use when they do these correspondences in Akkadian. So, for example, the name Yahweh or Jehovah, that would be the name by which Solomon knew God and worshiped God. But in the Hebrew Bible, you also see El and Elohim used as names of God. And El was a more generic name of God in the region. And if your name of God is special and you don't want to you don't want it to be profaned by foreign lips, which a lot of these religions were kind of that way, not just the Hebrew religion. Then you would use a more generic name for your God in your title when you're dealing with the other nations in your diplomatic correspondence. So that, for example, we talked last time about Ishi-Adu as opposed to Ishbaal. Ishbaal was his actual name in Hebrew, and Ishi-Adu, which means the same thing, but using the word Adu is Adad. So they're using a more generic name than Baal that the other people of the region would understand.
Gotcha, gotcha. So, okay, so you've identified um, various kings of Katana with the kings of Israel during the United Monarchy. And you say Katana is a particular city um, whose throne the kings of Israel occupied. Could you just tell us what Katana is, and then what is Katana in relation to the Bible?
Okay. I'm going to make the case right here that Katana was the city of Dan, that, or Katna is, it got contracted to. The Hebrew word for city is Kiriath, and it also was a word used by the surrounding nations. And we see in Hebrew, Kiriath Arba was the name of the city of which Abraham lived next to. Sorry, I think it was down here, right about there. It was contracted to Kebron. So the Kiriath got contracted to just a Ka sound, Ka. And Arba got contracted to Bron. And you end up with Hebron as the name of the city after Abraham's time that had begun as Kiriath Arba. Carchemish is a city up here on the Euphrates, and it was the city of the sun god Chemosh. And so Kiriath Chemosh got contracted to Kar Chemosh. And there's another city named Kar, and that just means city, or the big city. That's up here in Syria. So we believe that what happened was the city was founded called Kiriath Dan, and it was contracted to Kadan, and then the D got shifted to a T sound, at least in the Akkadian language, and you ended up with a city named Katna or Katana. And this city is mentioned a lot in these letters of the Northern Kings. Now, we are told by archaeologists today that Tel Dan is right here. Here's the little, sorry, it's so tiny on your screen. Here is the Sea of Galilee, right by the G on Genesis 15 there. Just to the north of it, maybe 50 miles north at the most, there's a tell that archaeologists have named Tel Dan. And they tell us that is the city of Dan because, in their view, Israel went just to the foot of Mount Hermon and down to the Gulf of Aqaba over to the Mediterranean. That was the size of Israel. It was never any bigger than that. We argue that no, actually, that Tel that they're calling Tel Dan wasn't Tel Dan. There was another kingdom there called Ma'aka at the time that the Bible talks about, and that Tel Dan was actually 160 miles north of there, way up here, close to a kingdom called Hamath. And that's the city that became called Katna. And I'm going to make the case for it by showing you the land promises from Abraham. So in Genesis 15, Abraham is told he will be given all the land from the Euphrates to the river of Egypt. And this picture I've got here is what I would call the minimalist position, that they're saying that that was true from this little section of the Euphrates, and the river of Egypt refers to a wadi, a dry riverbed that's about halfway down the Sinai, that pretty close to the border today. The maximalist position, having zoomed out, here's the Euphrates River running all the way down to the Gulf of the Persian Gulf. The maximalist position would say, well, and this is that 30-degree parallel, the 30-degree equator tipped up that we had talked about last episode as the possible boundary.
Right, right.
Which goes through the Great Pyramid. Oh, I guess you can't see it on the screen. I could move it maybe. At any rate, this is the Goshen area of Egypt. And so the maximalist position might be, well, Abraham was given all the land from the Euphrates all the way to the Nile, and north of 30 degrees. And we aren't sure, but I can tell you, we know that we're told in Genesis 25 that Abraham starts subdividing his territory. So it says he sent his sons, the sons of Keturah and also Ishmael, to the east. Well, we know they at least went this far east, meaning to this desert area on the east side of the Arabah and the Dead Sea and all that. But later we found out that they went down here to Babylon. They conquered all this area. They conquered all the way and established kingdoms, meaning the Amorites. The archaeologists call them the Amorites, and we're saying that the Amorites were actually the people of the East, according to the Bible. They were the tribes of Abraham's sons by Keturah and also Ishmael, and also some Arameans. And we also believe the Bible calls Aram, and it calls this kingdom Padan Aram or Aram Naharaim, which means Aram between the rivers. And it appears that Aram was given this little corner because Abraham is never given this little corner right there, which is the kingdom of Hamath, even though we're told Hamath was a Canaanite, one of the sons of Canaan. But Aram is also apparently given all the land between the Tigris and the Euphrates. And we see these Aramean tribes, like the Guti, or who we think are from Gether, they ended up occupying all this area between, and they also were associated with the Amorites. So we have Arameans occupying this area, and we've got Abrahamic tribes occupying this area. So the subdivision continues by the time the Exodus happens, and they are now in Numbers 32 to 34. The Israelites had come out and they had tried to go up here, and these kingdoms said, no, you can't go through our territory, you got to go around. So they go up and they go around, and they conquer King Og and the Amorites of Bashan. And then they make a treaty they're right here on this side of the Jordan River near Jericho. And before they cross the river, they basically make a treaty, and they agree that some of the Manasseh tribes and clans are going to get this chunk of land that they conquered from Sihon called Bashan, which had previously been the territory of Ammon, who was the son of Abraham's nephew Lot. So we now see also we're given a border line. It says you go from the sea to the city, the entrance of Hamath, and then down to a city named Zedad. And then it lists two more cities that we aren't sure where they are. And then it says you go down to Riblah and the city of Ain. So it's not including Damascus in this territory for Israel. And then the line follows basically the center of the valley all the way down to the tip of the Gulf of Aqaba. And so that's the description we have of the territory in Numbers 32 to 34. Then we get to Joshua, and they actually go out and do the conquering. And again, it looks pretty much the same. And again, it keeps describing the northern border is the entrance to Hamath. And the question that we're going to ask is, there is a city today called Hamah, which is called the city of Hamath. And it's believed that Hamah is the city they were talking about as the entrance to Hamath. Well, that could mean that it means like the Orontes watershed, in which case the border might have been maybe 60, 80 miles further south. But there's this kingdom called Yamhad, which the capital was what's today called Aleppo. We believe Yamhad is Hamath. It's the same city, it's the same name. That's just the older version of it, kind of the way Kiriath Arba got turned into Hebron. Yamhad got turned into Hamath. And we believe that this city of Hamath is actually the city that was built at the border. So this was like the gate at the entrance of Hamath. You've got the Orontes River. It kind of comes down here. The Orontes River runs up here. It's actually running this straight. It starts here, and it does this little loop like this, and then it goes up the valley, and it comes out near Antioch. We think that basically this city was like a toll gate, effectively, on the road, because there's a river crossing here and a river crossing there, and it's in this secure location in this little bend of the river. That was basically the entrance to the kingdom of Yamhad, and that's what they're talking about as the border. And there's also a gap in the mountains that the Lebanon mountains that run along the coast. There's a little gap here where there's a river that comes from over here into the Mediterranean. And so it's very easy to travel there. And it would be a good natural place to have a division of your boundary. What we don't have in this description in Joshua yet, it's still not talking about this territory that goes from the city of Katna all the way to the river. But later we are going to see that. In fact, in the Mary letters, Mary is here. It's on this side of on the south side of the Euphrates. There's a city called Sagaratim, and this is the Khabar River that later, I think Ezekiel was placed in a city along that river by the Assyrians when they took him captive. Well, in the Mari letters, they're fighting with this tribe called Benjamina over this city called Sagaratim. Benjamina is fighting them to control the territory along the Euphrates River. Well, Benjamina, any Jewish person can tell you, means Benjamin. Benjamina is Benjamin. It means son of the right hand. And if you look at the archaeologists, their explanation is, oh, they mean since the river flowed this way and Benjamina were on this side of the river, Benjamina just means they lived on the right-hand bank of the river. And they have nothing to do with the Israelite Benjamites. And we will say, no, actually, Benjamina is the ethnic name that these people were using for Israel because King Saul, who fought them, was from the tribe of Benjamin. And so they viewed all of Israel as Benjamina. And so we see in their letters, they refer to Katna as the kingdom of Katna, the city of Katna. But so that's what they mean by the state of Israel, or the word they use for it. And they use Benjamina to refer to the ethnicity, or effectively the tribes of Israel. And
I see.
What do you have on your list of questions?
So I just want to, before we get into that, I just want to briefly ask why they chose Katna as the city uh, over which they would, choose to identify the throne of Israel by. Is because it's the nearest regnal city, or
Yeah, so remember how I talked about Hammurabi of Babylon as king of this many cities. Well, Hammurabi had more cities than Babylon. That was where he started. But for these guys, the kings of these cities up here dealing with Israel, King Saul, even though he was from Gibeah, it never really talks in the Bible about Gibeah being built as a capital city. And Jerusalem wasn't even conquered until King David conquered it from, remember Joab goes up the cave and he sends someone up the cave and they capture it from the Jebusites.
right.
So in the reign of Saul, Jerusalem wasn't even a thing. It's not even there. So the only major cities in Israel in the time of King Saul were the city of Dan and the city of Hazor. And both of those are mentioned in these letters. So I think they just started referring to Katna because it was the biggest city. It was the largest economy in the Israelite area. And then as things started changing, obviously David moved the capital when he built Jerusalem, and Solomon's capital was Jerusalem. But they still continue to refer to them as king of the city next door because that's what they've been calling it. Just like we call Germany, Germany. You cannot find, Germans don't refer to their country as Germany. They call it Deutschland. And it's the similar kind of thing.
Right. Okay. So could you tell us then a little bit about those kings of Katna that are identified in the Mari archives, what their relationship is to biblical characters, and if you could explore the relationship between the names in the Mari archive and the names of the biblical characters.
All right. So from the archives in both Mari and Katna itself, which they dug up, we found a certain number of kings. There are a few more than these known, which are from the later divided kingdom era. But these are the order we placed them in. We have identified Idada. The archaeologists place him later, and we think they say he's the father of an Amut Piel. So we think Idada has to be David because David's the father of Solomon, and Amutpel is identifiable as Solomon by his actions. And also, we know that Amutpel II follows Ishiadu, and Ishiadu is very clearly identified as Ishbosheth. So we have Amutpel the first, or servant of God, servant of El, is Saul. And the Bible tells us Saul fought against the kings of Zobah. And so Shamshi-Adad, he was a king for about 25 years before he conquered Asher, according to the eponym list that we have for him. And we think that Saul was fighting him for that territory along the Euphrates, back up here. So King Saul is fighting Shamshi-Adad, or Hadadezer, as he's called in the Bible, the kings of Zobah. He's fighting for that territory there. Well, Saul dies, and Shamshi-Adad, or Hadadezer, he makes this marriage treaty with Ishiadu, where his son Yazma-Adad marries the daughter of Ishiadu. And they have this marriage alliance, but it only lasts for about 6 or 7 years because there's this rebellion against Ishiadu that Shamshi-Adad sends troops to support Ishiadu, but David was basically fighting his civil war against Ishbosheth. So Ishbosheth gets murdered by his captains. And so then you have Idada, which is recognizable as David. We also see we see a number of similar names to David in this time frame in the Mary text. You see names like Dadusha, Daida, or Dadia. And the Hebrew for David is hard to pronounce because you have this D and then it's like Dawood. And then the Europeans Latinize it into David. But at the time he lived, it apparently was closer to Dawood or possibly Dayad. And so this is believable as David's name. And his name, they also have a letter that refers to his father, who's not a king. And David was an Israelite king whose father was not a king. His father was named Jesse. And you can kind of recognize the name Jesse in the name of the father of Idada. So David, it tells us that David was an ally after he defeated Hadadezer, or Shamshi-Adad, as we say, that the king of Hamath sent his son Joram, or Jehoram, to David with gifts, and they made a treaty. Well, we recognize Joram as Yeram-Lim of Yamhad and Hamath. So Yamhad is Hamath, and Joram is Yeram. And Lim is we talked about theophorics previously. In Hebrew, the theophoric would be Yah means Yahweh, El means God. Well, Lim is what the kings of Hamath are using instead of El. So in the Hebrew, when they translate a name like Yeram-Lim, they would change it to Jehoram, or you might see El something. So we have another king. Actually, I'll get to that later. Let's continue down these kings of Israel. So after Idada, you have Amutpel II, and remember that statement we had up here. This has to be in the first 5 years of his reign because Rim-Sin hasn't been conquered yet by Hammurabi. So at the beginning of Solomon's reign, everyone around him is acknowledging that the king of Hamath has the most followers. He has the largest number of kings, those cities that follow him, because he's got 20. Later, we would say that Solomon exceeded that, but we never get another statement like that actually compares later in Solomon's reign. So we do know that after the death of Shamshi-Adad, or Hadadezer, there was another king of Mari named Zimri-Lim. And Zimri-Lim had fled from Shamshi-Adad earlier because Shamshi-Adad had killed his father and conquered the city of Mari. And Zimri-Lim fled to Yeram-Lim of Yamhad. He fled to him as an exile. And Yeram-Lim's father gave him Yeram-Lim's sister as a wife. So Zimri-Lim is basically the brother-in-law of Yeram-Lim. And after Shamshi-Adad died, Yeram-Lim helped install Zimri-Lim back on the throne of the city of Mari. Well, the Bible tells us that Solomon had an enemy named Rezon, El Rezon or Rezon, who was his enemy all of his days, and that the father of El Rezon was named Eliada. Well, the father of Zimri Lim was Yadun Lim. And again, if you take the lim, convert it to El, stick it on the front, you end up with El Yadun, which is very recognizable as Eliada, the father of Rezon, the enemy of Solomon. And so we see Amutpiel's main enemy is this guy named Zimri Lim, and he builds such a huge palace in the city of Mari. They said it had 251 rooms, and it was so big, other people wanted to come see the palace. And there's actually evidence of kings who follow Yerim Lim writing Yerim Lim to ask permission to go visit Zimri Lim's palace because they want to see it, like tourism. So we believe that Zimri Lim was Rezon, the enemy of Solomon, and that here you have another example. In the Bible, it says he's the king of Damascus, but obviously his capital was Mari, and we think that's another example of you refer to your neighbor's closest city, he's king of that city. So even though his capital was in Mari, because he controlled Damascus, which was right up, go up here and look at this. Damascus is right here. So Solomon has, it's like a burr in his flank because his capital is way down here, Jerusalem. And he's trying to control, Solomon controlled, it tells us, from the Euphrates, and he built the city of Palmyra, which in the Bible calls, not Tabor, something like Tabor, Tadmor. So Solomon builds, that's one of his royal cities that he builds as a fortress. And you can see that this is, militarily, this is not a great border to have to try to defend, especially if your enemy has a city right here, right near your bottleneck, where if he did a campaign, like if he did a campaign to Sidon, he could cut your whole country in half. So we believe that Rezon, basically, this is his capital, but he controlled the city of Damascus, and he was Solomon's enemy, and he's basically controlling this territory. Okay, after the death of Amutpiel, the archaeologists call Yahad-Abum the crown prince, but I think that's obviously mistaken because Jeroboam the first did not have any blood relation to Solomon that we know of. But we do know in the Bible that Jeroboam was the first one who started the practice of idolatry in Israel, of open idolatry. Solomon built temples for his wives, unfortunately. So you could say that Solomon perhaps began the practice, but it wasn't open. Whereas Solomon still worshiped Yahweh at the temple, and the temple still had no idols in it. Jeroboam basically built a golden calf. He built two, actually, one in the north and one in the south. And we find him in the record as Yahad-Abum. And Yahad-Abum has a son who, in the record, we see the Akkadian for him is Senadu. And in the Bible, he is Nadab. We see the NAD root in the middle. And this king apparently had an archery contest. Thutmose III of Egypt, when he basically, we believe, was the Shishak who broke up the kingdom of Israel into 4 or 5 lesser nations and made all of them his vassals. And on one of his trips to Katna, he had an archery contest with the king of Katna. And you would wonder, if Katna was had nothing to do with Israel, why is this king of Egypt having an archery contest with this guy when he stops by, hundreds of miles away from the territory of Egypt? And the answer would be Jeroboam, when he started his rebellion, he fled to Egypt and took his family. So he hid from Solomon for a certain number of years in Egypt. Thutmose III was basically preparing his big move. He was under his I guess his aunt Hatshepsut. He's co-regent with her for his youth, but you could tell he was just itching to get his hands on the reins of power and do it his way. And so I think that he was basically good friends with Jeroboam the first, and possibly his son Nadab might have been his age. And so when he later conquers Israel, and then he is going up there on a campaign all the way to go up to Syria, he stops in Katna, where his friend Nadab, who's the crown prince of Jeroboam, is there, and they have an archery contest.
And
So
the archery contest is that what while he is reigning as king of northern Israel, or is that while he's the crown prince?
that is difficult for me to say at this point. I would say he was crown prince. Um, Tutmos lived a long time. I think the problem is we don't have we may have a year reference for that. I need to go back and check. I'll just say leave that for now. I don't know, but I
Okay,
think I can find out.
sure.
All right, and then we have some later kings that are recognizable, also kings of Katna. The main one is Akizi, who is in the Elamarna letters, who we believe was Jehu's son Jehoahaz.
Are you
But
sorry? Did you mean to go to your next slide, or
yeah, okay, we can do that.
no, no, no. I just wanted to make sure you were on the right thing.
Yeah, I just this is all the ones I did for this lecture because really when we get down to Jehoahaz as Akizi, that's the divided kingdom era. So
Gotcha.
let's just stick with this.
Okay.
Um, so again, we have all this cluster of matching names and events in the Bible. Even so, I've mentioned Zimri-Lim, El-Rizan. The Bible says Rizan, who fled from his master Hadad-Ezer. And again, we have that in the record. Zimri-Lim fled from Shamshi-Adad when Shamshi-Adad killed his father, and then he came back after the death of Shamshi-Adad and took power after his death. So this perfectly fits. The names fit. The names of the fathers of both. Shamshi-Adad's father is Iri Kab. The Bible says Hadad-Ezer's father was Rekob. The father of Zimri-Lim is Yadin-Lim, and the father of El-Rizan in the Bible is El-Yada, and we can recognize these as the same. There's also one of the officials in the Limnu list of Shamshi-Adad was named Abu Salim. We actually see several people named this, like it was a somewhat popular name. I'm not saying that Absalom worked for Shamshi-Adad. He didn't. He was, I think, probably born right at the end of that guy's life. But my point was that at this time in the Mari text, we have all these names that are very similar to names that are unique in the Bible. We don't see the Hebrews continuing to use the name Absalom.
Right.
So the fact that you see these names, that's another kind of flag telling you we're in the right ballpark. We're in the right time frame. Everything fits. It fits very nicely.
Yeah. Yeah. Could I just ask on, sorry, this is out of left field, just methodologically, whether did you observe, you and Daryl Wright, who is I know your co-author, the synchronisms between the names in the Bible and the Mari letters first, or was that something you looked for after triangulating the relative dates, or is it kind of both at the same time kind of thing?
So Dean Hickman published a paper on this back in 1986, I think, in one of the journals. There was about 8 of these revisionist journals going at the time. And there's a CD you can get called the Catastrophism Review CD, and it's in there. It's like this library of all these old papers. And so he's the one who first noticed that Zimri-Lim was probably Rizan, and that Shamshi-Adad was probably Hadad-Ezer. He did not make the identification of the kings of Katna as the Israelite kings. So later, there on that site I told you about called specialtyinterest.net, which is no longer there, but it was a place where people would write these kinds of articles back in the late 90s and early 2000s. A guy named Damian Mackey had written a number of articles kind of fleshing that out. And Damian Mackey you can find him on academia. He is a very prolific and we find that we disagree with him on the vast majority of his identifications, but that this is one that we do agree with him on.
Right.
So he got it right. So the difference between Damian Mackey and our method is that he really rejects the discipline of durations. He hates math. He told me he doesn't like math, he said. And he is a pure literary. He compares them literarily and by the events in their life, and then he tries to fold them together. And we don't do it that way. We say you've got to prove two of them were living at the same time using durations, and then you can compare the names and the deeds, and then maybe say this guy was actually that guy. So
Right. Okay. So would you tell us a little bit then about how this revision relates to the 18th dynasty of Egypt, which for my viewers, again, this is the dynasty of Egypt that arises after the expulsion or at the point of the expulsion of the Hyksos, and it constitutes the kind of revival of Egyptian civilization after that intermediate period. So how does the United Monarchy of Israel relate to this period in Egyptian history?
well, what we found was 8 very tight synchronisms between the Israelite kings of Judah and the kings of the 18th dynasty of Egypt down to Akhenaten. We believe the 18th dynasty continued well past Akhenaten. Most scholars basically end it with Horemheb, who was allegedly the general of one of the generals who worked for Akhenaten. But we'll do that in a different episode. But for now, we'll just cover this early 18th dynasty, or the main 18th dynasty, as it's accepted by everybody. Nobody disagrees that these are the kings of the 18th dynasty. So we mentioned in the previous episode, we have strong synchronism to Saul's defeat of Agag matches with the war against the Hyksos with Kamos and Amos, who founded the 18th dynasty. We have another synchronism in the year that Kamudi was killed. Kamudi was the final of the Hyksos kings. With David, we have the Hadad-Ezer campaign. Remember, Shamshi-Adad, Hadad-Ezer. David fought 2 campaigns against him. And the second campaign we place about just after the middle of David's reign. So roughly probably his 22nd year, thereabouts. And Thutmose I, he had a campaign in his second year where he went all the way to Mitanni. He says, I campaigned all the way to Mitanni, and then he went elephant hunting. Apparently, it was like the high point of his life. And we believe that he was an ally with David, and that was the campaign against Zobah, where David goes to Zobah, and the capital of Shamshi-Adad, and he basically takes all of his shields and hamstrings the horses. We believe these guys were allies together on that campaign. And we've said that we believe Shamshi-Adad was also the same person whose Hurrian name was Shaush-Tatar, which conventional history has basically several centuries later. Shaush-Tatar conquered Assyria, took a golden door from the temple. He also had a battle with Thutmose I, and he was defeated at least once, but he was planning to invade Palestine, but he died before the invasion could be completed. And all of that fits perfectly with Shamshi-Adad and our placement with him and the 18th dynasty. The next synchronism is the 4th year of Solomon, where you've got the temple. Obviously doesn't connect to the Egyptian side, but it does later. We have the 9th year voyage of Hatshepsut falls in the 24th year of Solomon. And we don't go as far as Velikovsky, who said the voyage to Punt was the voyage to Jerusalem of the Queen of the South. We would say that it could have been, but there's a lot of scholars who will argue until they're blue in the face to say that Punt could not have been Israel. Punt had to be in the South. So rather than try to argue with them about that, we will just say we can show that Hatshepsut was contemporary with Solomon, and her voyage was around the middle of his reign after he had a big war in his 20th year. It says he went up against Hamath-Zobah. Where does that sound familiar? And then it says she came to visit him shortly after that. So
And and do you think that she undertook her visit to Solomon, whether or not it was the Punt expedition? Do you think she undertook that while she was reigning as king of Egypt, or do you think she undertook that while she was the great wife of the preceding pharaoh?
I think it was after she was king.
Okay.
I think that she kind of got too much power once she was king. She did things that I don't think she would have been allowed to do when she was the wife of Tutmosis II.
Okay.
So, and obviously, she somewhat dominated Tutmosis the third in his childhood. It's fairly some of her depictions have been crossed out, and they're not sure if that was done by Tutmosis the third or Amenhotep the third, but there was definitely a conservative rightward movement in Egyptian culture after her death. They seem to think that it was inappropriate that she had that much power as a woman.
Right.
So at any rate, we can place them the same time, even if we don't nail the punt voyage as the actual same visit. The next very strong synchronism is between when Shishak comes up and he defeats Rehoboam and he makes Judah his vassal. That was the year 30 of Tutmosis III. He had a campaign where he took Kadesh as the top city on that campaign. We believe that was his conquest of Jerusalem. However, there's a curious thing. He has a campaign in his 23rd year where he also went into Palestine, and we have Solomon still alive. And the big story of the defeat of Kadesh is in his annals. It's placed as this first campaign, and we suspect that he was actually an ally of Solomon, and that he had done a campaign to help Solomon put down maybe the last Canaanite stronghold of Megiddo, because Solomon, it says he built Megiddo. He also built Gezer, both of which had been conquered by the Egyptian kings for at least Gezer was conquered by an Egyptian king for him. And we suspect that Megiddo was the actual city that was conquered that year, but that because he did it as a vassal of Solomon, and his annals are written about 20 years later, he doesn't want that in his annals. He doesn't want it in his annals that he was a servant of Solomon. So he replaces that campaign with a description of the year 30 campaign of his great defeat of as he calls him, the wretched king of Kadesh, who he's referring to Rehoboam. So that's obviously, you could view that as a flaw in our chronology, or we argue that it's a flaw in the Egyptian chronology, a deliberate distortion that they did because they didn't want to admit that he served Solomon.
You agree with Velikovsky that the king of Kadesh here is Rehoboam?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And so for viewers who are not familiar with this whole issue, the identification of Shishak, the king of Egypt, who comes up against Jerusalem and robs the temple, is kind of a major issue in ancient chronology. Conventional historians identify him as Shawshank of, I think, the 22nd dynasty. I might be wrong about that.
You're right.
Yeah, he's Shawshank, and David Roll, who's gotten a lot of press, identifies him with Ramses II of the 19th dynasty. Peter James, Centuries of Darkness, identifies him with Ramses III of, I believe, the 20th dynasty. So this is kind of a lot of
flavor.
Sorry?
Pick your flavor, right?
Yeah, exactly. And so this is a lot of things when you work backwards and work forwards kind of revolve around this date. Could I just ask you briefly why you think that he is identified with the name Shishak? Do you think this has any kind of relationship with any of Tutmos's throne names, or do you think this is a nickname that the Israelites gave him? If you have any ideas on that question.
In Hebrew, Shishak means robber. Solomon built the temple, made all this stuff. So we have this period of Israelite history. He's making all these beautiful, just wonderful furniture and instruments, all this gold and silver. He's all this stuff that he built in the temple. Huge amounts of labor went into this. The best craftsman in the world, and it doesn't even last one more king's reign until it gets stolen, and he takes it all. Shishak carries it all away, and I can see why they would call him the robber. He had a
Sorry, just one more thing on this. Do you agree with Velikovsky that the images at Karnak Temple are images of the treasures that were taken from the temple, or would you say that that's something different is going on there?
I would say some of them could be, but there was a lot of loot that Tutmos took on that campaign from a lot of cities, including possibly Solomon's Egyptian wife's palace.
Right. Okay.
So the other question is, did Tutmos just hand it over as is, or did he have his own craftsmen rework that, melt the gold down, and make it into Egyptian style artifacts for his god? And I think because of that, like just like he did with the Queen of Sheba in Hatshepsut's voyage to Punt, I think he went too far. He went too far out on a limb to say that the images on the column at the Karnak temple are the actual temple, uh, whatever you call the things of the temple.
Yeah.
Um, he didn't need to go that far. I guess maybe it seemed to strengthen his case, but the problem is if you use a weak argument in an otherwise strong case, then people, when they want to attack your argument, if they want to attack the case, they're going to go after that weak argument. And so that's exactly what they've done. The critics of Velikovsky just latch onto that and tear it apart. So I would say you don't need to say that. It could be that some of the stuff made it onto the Karnak inscription, but it could be that Thutmose just melted it all down and then remade it into the kind of things that his god would want, the way his priest would want it. So,
Gotcha. Gotcha.
okay, the next synchronism, which is a really tight one, is between Zerah and Asa. In the Bible, we're told that Asa, he basically had about a 5 or 6 year civil war, not a civil war, a war with the Egyptians that started around his year 10 and ended in his year 15. And the culmination was this battle near the city of Gezer, and it tells you the exact location of the battle, with 2 million Ethiopians led by a person named Zerah. It doesn't call him a king. And we actually find this was the 9th year of Amenhotep II, and that he had a co-reign with his father. It was the 9th year as Sol Rex. And he wasn't in this battle. He had a man called User Satet, or User Atet, no, User Satet, who was the king's viceroy of Kush, meaning Ethiopia. And he's actually listed in the Ethiopian king list as King Sarah, who was the third one. They believe that he was descended from Thutmose III. The Ethiopians call this king Menelik, and they call her Candace. And so you have this third king, Sarah. He's in the Ethiopian king list as king of Ethiopia, but he's in the Egyptian records as the king's vizier of Kush for Amenhotep. And Amenhotep was fighting these battles in basically Israel and Judah area for the first 5 years of this war, and then all of a sudden the 6th year looks the year 9 campaign, which was the 6th year of the war, has a very fishy looking claims of captives and everything, where even the conventional scholars say it looks like he just made this up. And then he stops. He never campaigns again after that. He just stops going to war. So, but we do have this one inscription where he sent a letter to this this guy Uzer Satet, and the letter is kind of weird. It's saying don't trust the Asiatics about this and that, but it kind of looks like he's ridiculing him. It's almost like it's an inside joke of some kind that we don't quite get what he's saying. But this king of Ethiopia was so possibly terrified by having been sent this critical letter. He had it inscribed on a stone pillar, and it's still there. Actually, I guess it's now might be in Massachusetts. It's been it's been dug up, obviously, and carried away. But this year is identifiable definitely as the 15th year of Asa, and it's 939 BC. And then the next section, we have some co-regencies in both the Judah side and also on the Egyptian side. You can see here we've got Thutmose IV co-regent with Amenhotep III for the entire reign. We have a little 6-year co-regency between Thutmose and Amenhotep II. We basically some historians will just go crazy with co-regencies, and they'll invent them to solve a problem. Whereas we only use them where if we have two different chroniclers and one says Amenhotep reigned, say, 25 years, and another one says he reigned 35 years, then we suspect there might be a 10-year co-regency with either his predecessor or the one after him. And so we basically put together the 18th dynasty, and we only use co-reigns where in cases like that where we had two different values for the kings, and it turned out it seems to all fit together pretty tightly. And we end up with the final synchronism of this section being right around the time of Jehu. We have in the Bible, right before Jehu becomes king, 2 years before him, roughly, Hazael becomes king of Damascus and the Arameans. Hazael does that by murdering Ben-Hadad the first by putting a rag over his face while he's sick in bed. He basically smothers him to death, or you could say he waterboarded him. At any rate, he kills him. And at this time in history, in these letters to Akhenaten, you have this crisis happens between the kings of the Hittites and the kings of a kingdom called Mitanni. And we showed earlier that Thutmose I, he has this campaign against Mitanni, and we showed that that was basically this Shamshi Adad, who's the king of Mari and all these other areas, Shaush-Tatar. And so now we are several generations later. You've got this king of Mitanni named Tushratta, and we believe he's the same guy in the Bible as Ben-Hadad the first. He's the one who's the king of Damascus who gets smothered by Hazael. Well, in the records of the Amarna letters and also the Hittite treaties, we have this record that Tushratta, who we think was Ben-Hadad, that he was murdered by one of his sons, and the question is, which one was it? And so one son named Shati-Waza and the other son, they both accuse each other. And Shati-Waza flees to the Hittite king, and the Hittite king, Suppiluliumus, he basically puts him on the throne. He gives him one of his daughters to marry, and he puts him on the throne and helps defeat his brother. And we believe Shati-Waza was Hazael, and everything fits chronologically. It all fits in very tight specifications for the events described in Scripture for that transition from Ben-Hadad to Hazael, and basically the murder of Tushratta and the rise of Shati-Waza to the throne. So Waza appears to be Hazael. He also appears as a name in the El Manra letters as Aziru. And there's a later Aziru, and this this gets into where all the revisionists are really arguing over this time period and later,
Right.
because it's so hard to nail this time period down. There's a number of different ways you can put it together. And so I think the reason we came to doing it this way is, unlike the other revisionists who they start with the fall of Jerusalem and then go back, because we use this method of finding the Tower of Babel dates and the dispersion dates and then the Exodus dates and working down toward us, toward the future, and then working back, we're able to meet in the middle and basically get durations that go forward and back to confirm that we're in the right place. Here's an example. Kamudi, we have him killed in toward the end of the reign of Saul, and we can very precisely link this to Saul. Well, and we obviously, as we've done in this series, we can count down from the dispersion and Menes and then the Exodus and then the Hyksos period to get an exact date for this guy's death. Well, there are two durations that we have forward from him to the 19th dynasty, to Seti. One is this called the 400-year stele, which says Ramses made it for his father Seti, celebrating 400 years from the expulsion of the Hyksos until something in the reign of Seti. And we have Seti the Great becoming basically he was put on the throne by Ashurbanipal and he was just a governor under his father. But there was a rebellion by Taharka against his father, which caused his father to be killed. And then Ashurbanipal invades Egypt again, like the third time, in 663 BC with Seti, and defeats Thebes and puts Seti on the throne of Thebes. And they view this as the expulsion of the Ethiopians, the Cushites. And so this 400-year stele is celebrating 400 years between two similar events. You have the expulsion of the Hyksos in 1063, and then you have the expulsion of the Ethiopians in 663. And that enables us to tie it back from events around the time of the fall of the temple. There's another duration in Josephus that from the expulsion of the Hyksos until Seti was, I think it was 393 years. And we would place that 7 years earlier. That's 670 BC, when Esarhaddon conquered Egypt, and he first put the governors on the throne. And we believe that Seti had another name, which was Psammetichus of Dynasty 26, and that his father was known as it just slipped my mind. Ramses. No, it was Necho the First.
Okay.
So his father was Necho the First. Esarhaddon put both of them on thrones as governors. So you could argue that that was the first elevation of Seti, the man who became Seti, to the throne of anything, was the year 670, and that fits Josephus's duration to Sethos. So at any rate, that's how we've done it. I realize that this is going to be the more we go into the next 300 years, this gets highly controversial, and our method seems to make it fit together. And I'll be happy to talk about mistakes we think that the other guys have made, but this is a very fiercely defended area, and I'm sure I'll be harshly criticized over this. So,
well, thank you so much, and the enthusiasm for these discussions is really high. I know one guy in the last video said that every 2 minutes he was vigorously texting his friend about things he was learning from these. So I know people are really enjoying these. And hopefully in a week, we will be back to discuss some of those more controversial periods and get into more detail about this stuff. So thank you so much.
all right, thank you.